Hello and welcome to the IIC webinar. I want to offer a particular welcome to our international audience. The title of this webinar is Privacy and Pandemic, the Evolving Privacy and Data Protection Considerations for the Telecoms, Media and Technology Sector. This webinar is scheduled to last 90 minutes. I am Paul Canessa, Chief Executive Officer of the Gibraltar Regulatory Authority. We have four top-rate panelists joining us. Simon McDougall, the Executive Director, Technology and Innovation at the Information Commissioner's Office of the UK. Bojana Bellamy, President of the Centre for Information Policy Leadership. Dr. Richard Benjamins, Chief AI and Data Strategist at Telefonica. And Gregory Smolinek, Deputy Commissioner Policy and Promotion at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. Each panelist will give a short presentation, and I will allow a couple of questions from the audience after each presentation. Questions may be submitted using the facility on your screen. There will be a full Q&A at the end. Our first speaker is Simon McDougall.
Firstly, I'll talk about our initial response to COVID-19. Operationally, everything went fine, so we're okay in terms of our business continuity point of view. We managed to adapt to working out of the office very quickly, which was unlike some organisations. But we found that we were engaged in a really wide range of technical questions very quickly, very early on, because data is so embedded into our lives now, and the use of data in COVID-19 was just popping up in a whole range of different scenarios. So very early on, we were getting questions around, lots of questions around health data sharing and how different health authorities in the UK could share information with one another. We had questions around how both government and local authorities could use and share information about vulnerable people who may either be more likely to suffer badly if they had COVID, and indeed, people who should be actively shielding and staying at home. As the crisis progressed, we got more questions around innovation and use of technology. So, the various situations of the contact tracing app that have happened both in England and across Great Britain, as well as other areas, some areas to do with understanding how to restart the economy, questions about temperature testing, a really wide range. At the last count, we had well over 500 different individual cases that we were dealing with around COVID and data protection. The contact tracing app was just one case out of that, so it's a really broad range. And we reorganised ourselves internally to address that. So we made some public statements about how we were going to deprioritise a wide range of activity in order to staff up into this rapid response. So many people here will know that one of my pet subjects is ad tech and real-time bidding. Right now that's on pause. We're still doing a bit of discussion in the background, as you'd expect, around how we go back to that, but we're not actively working on that right now. To be crystal clear, that doesn't mean it's been deprioritised permanently in any way. We will come back to ad tech, but along with pretty much anything which doesn't have a direct COVID nexus, it's basically waiting for us to get back to a position where we can take resources away from the front line of COVID and back onto those areas. And we actually spun up specialist teams, and I'm the accountable executive for two teams. One is the team handling all this case management, so the team providing this advice to different bodies trying to deal with aspects of COVID and data protection. And then a separate team which is trying to think through what the new normal looks like. So what will the challenges be a few weeks and months down the line rather than a few hours and days? And it does feel right now that even at this point, many of the issues we're dealing with do change on an hourly basis. So, and I'd say that in terms of the cases that we've had going through, Paul, there has been very often there's a kind of a two-stage approach to the questions we're dealing with. The first stage is often a bit technical and dry and legalistic. So there's questions around, well, is there a lawful basis for sharing this data? That kind of classic data protection question. Can we do this according to the letter of the law? And I should say there that the GDPR overall has scrubbed up pretty well. You know, it's a complex piece of legislation. I'm sure it hasn't got a huge number of fans out there in the audience, but in terms of it working in a pandemic, the drafters of the legislation catered for this scenario. And what we have found is sometimes to our surprise, to be frank, when we've looked to say, well, how can this sensible measure be accommodated within the GDPR? Then through questions of public interest, public task, there's been ways to say, you know, we should carry on with taking these steps around data to fight COVID in a way which continues to be compatible with the GDPR. And that's been quite a pleasing aspect of this. But the second aspect is, after the first flush of questions, is something legal? We then get into questions of necessity and proportionality, and those questions are often more nuanced. And I think are the questions that will come back to us as we work through the pandemic. Some things which are clearly necessary now might not always be necessary as the pandemic in time recedes. And some things which might make sense as an emergency measure may need to be revisited at a later date. And so just because things are okay now doesn't mean they will always be okay. We need to keep that in mind. The flip side is I don't think anybody is anticipating going back to the way things were before. And in particular, I think around health data sharing, and this is a very, very small silver lining in what is a very huge COVID-shaped cloud. You know, we have broken down barriers, at least in the UK, around health data sharing. There are practices going on now which would have been a good thing to have had for a long time, but have not happened because of a mix of culture, inability to work with legacy technology, sometimes regulatory issues, but not always regulatory issues, sometimes just a misunderstanding or a reticence to act. And we've broken through many of those barriers and created and innovated and helped save lives through that. We don't want to go back just to kind of bad old ways. So part of the challenge, I think, for a data protection authority now, as we start to understand this new environment better, is how do we navigate into this new world in a way which keeps the value. I think we're going to go and talk at some point along here, almost certainly, around contact tracing. That's been a big part of our discussions. I think that this is the first, you know, global crisis where you know, genuinely apps have been able to offer help and support, and both digital contact tracing and manual contact tracing have become critical parts of government's responses to that. You know, I'll talk to this in more detail if we have questions on this, but you know, we came out very quickly and said that whilst we would work with any proportionate response around contact tracing, we liked the way that some of these decentralized approaches worked. We were keen to make sure that we were part of the discussion around public trust, but that these you know, but that the public trust and GDPR had to work hand in hand, and you had to have regulatory compliance and you know, and this building towards good practice to maintain public trust. Finally, Paul, I want to spend a minute just talking about future issues. We are, I think, at the cusp where we've dealt with a lot of the initial crisis, initial wave of issues, but there are plenty of things out there still coming up. And I think one of the areas that we are focusing on is the changing dynamics of the second wave. Are there risks that things which are voluntary now become mandatory in the future? That's an area of concern. How we navigate back to the new normal through. So in terms of future issues, there's these questions as we work our way through, how do we get back to a period which may well be months, even years, who knows, where we have proportionate responses to the pandemic, which enable us to live our lives in a relatively normal way, balancing privacy, which is an important right, but is not an absolute right, against people's freedom of movement, their ability to work, their ability to associate, to live their lives in a way which maintains trust and continues to be compliant with data protection, which is something which is critical with trust. And so we look at, you know, discussions around health certification or immunity passports, different ways apps may expand, which, you know, is not necessarily a bad thing, but scope creep is something to watch. And we're trying to think through what that new world looks like. And the one feature of this global pandemic is we can look around the world. Everyone is struggling with these challenges at the same time. So one thing that we are doing in the UK is working with other data protection authorities around the world to make sure that we compare notes and have good practice, and hopefully over time get to having a common accord as to what good looks like. So that's my 8 minutes, Paul. But that's where we are in the UK, and it's continuing to be a very, very challenging, but also a very rewarding time to be a data protection authority.
You talked about the track and trace, and we've had a question already from the audience on that, which I'd like to raise with you, but I'd like to return to that maybe after all the speakers have finished, because I know that Richard will probably have something to say, because from a Telefonica point of view, because track and trace was certainly used in Spain, so he will probably want to say something like that. But the question we had from the audience was related to two press articles. One which said that the UK government admitted that the track and trace scheme breaches GDPR, and then there was one that was published a few weeks later, which talked about the continued absence of a DPIA for track and trace. What's the ICO's view on this?
Well, the first thing to say is that I think DPIAs are a critical part of the data protection infrastructure, and it's really interesting how what was a slightly obscure part of the GDPR before COVID has now often become quite totemic as a mechanism through which to get public trust for these systems, and that's a really critical thing, because
I think we've lost Richard.
Sorry, Paul, did you lose me there?
Yeah, we lost you for a few seconds, Simon.
I got switched off apparently. So I was saying how it's really interesting how DPIAs have become something which the public have engaged with, when before I always thought that they should be a critical part of every organization's approach to data protection, but it wasn't something which was on the lips of individuals. And I should say, in terms of our engagement on track and trace and the like, we've actually received a number of DPIAs along the way as different things have been spun up, and we have also received the overarching DPIA, and are working with DHSC, Department of Health and Social Care, and others on how that scheme unfolds. But it is critical that we find ways to make sure that both good governance is evidenced, but that it's also communicated to the public. One thing that has come through again and again in terms of contact tracing, both manual and automated, is it only works if the public trusts both the institution and any of the technology being used. So there's no point having these mechanisms if people aren't willing to actually talk about who they're associated with, and that other people aren't happy to pick up the phone and have the conversation. So DPIAs and having different stakeholders from across the ecosystem, for want of a better phrase, working together to build public trust are critical. Otherwise, these approaches will not be effective in terms of supporting the fight against COVID.
Thank you very much, Simon. Let's move on to our second speaker now, who is Bojana, who will give us, I think, a different perspective on this topic. Bojana, over to you.
So we at CIPL have been giving quite a lot of thought to not only tactical impact of COVID on how organizations manage their data and data privacy compliance, but also more strategic, just the way Simon has been explaining. There's sort of several things on our website that I commend you to have a look at around particularly sort of the ways organizations can deliver accountability. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later today. But perhaps one thing that I want to talk about is actually what we have seen on the ground. how have organizations adapted to this new world? And just as Simon has said, COVID has really brought to home the need for this digital transformation and digital acceleration, the use of data, use of AI to all businesses and governments as well. So, and there is no going back from that moment, right? So everybody is now data company. Everybody is almost communication company, and everybody certainly is going through this digital transformation due to COVID. And we've seen a number of these trends. The first one was all about the need to ensure business continuity. Like organizations really needed to reimagine their workplace, reimagine their workforce. They needed to ensure health and safety of their employees, of their visitors, customers as well. New processes, how they're going to be operating and managing their business. And of course, this raises all kinds of privacy implications and security implications, working from home and so on. The second trend was all about new disruptors, new business models, new processes. We've seen companies that we've never heard of, right? Behind immunity passports in the UK, I hear, is a startup that has had huge seeding investment in now, who is going to be hopefully providing us with best technology, but we hope is going to be privacy respective and security as well respective. Zoom is a massive player now, has been before, but now we all live and on some of these communications platforms. So really, there's been a number of these new companies, new disruptors. So the question is, what is the role of these organizations, and how do we bring them up to the levels of maturity that they need in terms of protecting our data and privacy as well? Another trend has been the massive need and also call within corporate world to use data for social good, for public benefits to fight COVID. And, be it from the boards of directors or the leadership of organizations or even employees, everybody's been trying to contribute. Uber has not been just moving people from A and B, but they've been also transporting medicines and giving free rides or discounted rides to health workers, right? Amazon is not just anymore a website or virtual department store. They're actually almost essential infrastructure now. So we've seen actually, and of course you have heard, of course, about the mobility reports by Apple and Google and lots of telcos. So every company has tried to sort of help, and there's this push for massive use of data. And of course, with that comes the push for data sharing and wider data sharing frameworks between not just public and private sector, but between different private sectors as well. And this is something that we have seen, in a renewed focus on. And with that data sharing comes this appetite, what I call appetite for data. It is absolutely true that lots of these things are going to stay and continue in this new normal that Simon talks about. We are not going to be going back. So it is really important as to how we manage this new world. And of course, finally, there have been new cyber threats as well for organizations, and that has been a new threat, a new risk due to COVID as well. Now, all of this has raised data privacy issues, but it's also raising a number of opportunities for organizations. And I'm happy to discuss that further as well and drill later. We have seen equally a big change with regulators. And Simon mentioned some of the work that we have seen from the UK Information Commissioner. Dare I say UK ICO often leads where the others follow. And I'm not saying this because Simon McDougall is on the call, but actually it has been really refreshing to see the early on statements by the UK ICO saying that they're going to be pausing some of their enforcement and other work to be able to focus on COVID-related issues, not just to help organizations and government, but actually to enable use of data for COVID, right? So it's not just about data protection compliance, it's also about enabling and sharing of data in the way that respects the law and, of course, builds trust as well. And of course, they have also issued, the shift in their strategic plan and regulatory policy, which has been hugely welcomed. And of course, we've seen that from other regulators as well. So the need for regulators to anticipate these changes and to be able to also adapt to this new world is going to be very, very important. There is a huge appetite for data. People have been sharing a lot of things, and we have to understand that people are ready to perhaps even give away some of their privacy rights in order to get health and sort of right to life, right? And I think that shift in how people see privacy vis-a-vis other rights is going to be really important for regulators to understand as well. Of course, regulators also had to deal with evolving interpretations, so we are very grateful, and it's good to see the European Data Protection Board and some of the other regulators putting some really useful guidance out there interpreting GDPR, because it's not really the fact that GDPR is wrong. It's actually often the way we interpret our data protection rules, either because of reticence risk, or because of strictness of regulators, or because of fear of doing wrong and having this massive fine. So I think regulators have to be bold and courageous in these times to ensure proper interpretation of GDPR as well. I think with that comes sort of the need to promote what good looks like, accountability, and of course, accountable data sharing as well, and to also consider some innovative regulatory responses. We are seeing increased use of regulatory sandbox from Singapore to UK ICO to now Norwegian data protection regulator. And I think some of these big data sharing, contact tracing style, but also corporate projects that have arisen because of COVID, they would have been brilliant example for regulatory sandbox. Of course, the one that is also agile and fast moving, because this is really very fast moving place, as you know all. And of course, there are some other things, like, for example, data ethics or data review boards. Like, what is the role of data review boards, for example, again, in this type of pandemics or this massive cross public-private sector data sharing, for example, frameworks as well. And then finally, of course, regulators were also forced to collaborate with each other. At the beginning, as you know, it was a very much of a national response, but I'm really encouraged to see that in privacy, we are seeing a global privacy assembly, which is a grouping of all privacy regulators, set up a task force on COVID, where there's exchange of view, and I hope there's going to be some convergent guidance also coming out of that, but also with other regulators as well. I think that's also important. I know we've got a number of regulators, policymakers. This can't be dealt with one sort of regulators only. We really need a concerted action. And then final point I would like to make, and maybe we can show just very briefly a slide. Petra, we have actually at CIPL early on issued this op-ed. I kind of felt a little bit upset about reading all these media scare stories about, we have to give away our privacy for health and protection of life. And I kind of very strongly feel that we can achieve, and we must achieve both. There is no way in which you can sacrifice one right for the benefit of the others. So what does that accountable use of data look like? So we issued this op-ed, which is on our website. Please have a look at it, where we kind of talk about 12 accountability steps that organizations, both in private but also public sector, very importantly, we need governments also to practice this, can put in place and practice all the time through this life cycle of data use, and when there is a new project and another wave and another interesting things like immunity passports or whatever, contact tracing over borders, for example. So again, some of these principles are they're steeped in data protection laws, but some go beyond, right, in terms of what accounts to accountable or responsible use of data. So important to have clearly defined, documented purposes of data use. Why do we need this data? Do we actually need this data? Do the proportionality test. Can we do the same thing with less data? Do we actually need personal data? And I know Richard is going to be talking about this from Telefónica's perspective, because of course sometimes you can do a lot with just anonymize or aggregate data, but sometimes you need personal data, right? If in contact tracing, it actually we do need personal data because somebody needs to know how to contact me at some point. The role of privacy impact assessments, which go beyond just looking at what are the privacy implications, but what are the benefits of what we're trying to do, and then balancing these intrusions in privacy with the benefits of what we are trying to do as well. The need for transparency to socialize what we are doing. Of course, the need for security, the need to limit sort of the retention of data and further use of data. And we should enable further use of data. I think it's really important to understand that. I'm not in favor of limiting data for further purposes if those purposes are done, again, that documented and the privacy impact assessment is done. And of course, we are comfortable about managing these risks and we are using data responsibly. And then, of course, what are the roles and responsibilities of parties who are sharing data? What do the agreements look like that put in letter on paper those rules and requirements? How do we make sure we ensure audit and assessment of this sharing of data post facto? So it's not just done at the beginning, but actually as the project develops, how do we make sure we are verifying what is taking place as well? What does the internal and perhaps even external oversight look like? Do we have external validation from regulators? What about these data review boards? And finally, how do we incorporate some technical privacy by design and other sort of best measures and best practices? So I think lots of the stuff that we talk about here makes lots of common sense, but when in times of crisis, people forget, right? And people are very, companies and governments need to move very fast because there's a huge pressure, political, shareholder, whatever, right? Survival pressure. And I think some of these just have to be remembered and have to be embedded in how organizations actually work in the DNA of corporate. And the more we practice this, the more we're going to get better at doing this. And of course, together with regulators as well. So Paul, those are my introductory remarks.
I want to raise a little bit more with you is the problems that some organizations were found with complying with current rules and interpretations. What do you think were the main issues that these organizations found, and how could this be addressed going forward?
Sure. And I think some of the issues came, for example, from excessive use or additional use of employee data. So this is one thing that I think many regulators are sort of haven't been aware of how much, in fact, you need to monitor employees, both in terms of to protect your own systems when they're working remotely, or to ensure security of your data, but also to ensure the well-being and health of your people, but as well as your visitors, right? And other clients and customers who your employees get in touch with. So processing of employee data, I think, has been one thing which has really exploded. And I think we need regulators to be now aware of these reality. And, it's not helpful if we have a regulatory guidance which says you can't process employee health data because not even with consent because there is imbalance. Well, you know what? We might have to. In fact, we've seen companies where employees and works councils have been demanding that temperature checks because people wanted to go back to work, right? Or they wanted to be, engaged. And so I think employee data processing to me is going to be a really big issue of compliance. Another one is, as Simon has mentioned, technicalities. Again, what is the legal basis on which we process data? It needn't be always consent. It could be legitimate interest here. It could be public interest. It could be vital interest. But, do these work for sensitive personal data? Again, there we may need a little bit stretching of the legal provisions and a bit more bolder interpretation from regulators. Another one was around anonymous and aggregate data. So everybody knows that anonymous aggregate data is outside the scope of the data protection law, and you do whatever you can to mitigate the risk of de-identification. But if a regulator comes up, like a Dutch regulator, saying there's no such thing as anonymous data, right? Everything is personal data and everything has to, then that's not helpful. And then the whole notion of sharing aggregate data becomes impossible to do in practice, right? And then maybe final point is around this exemption that we have got in GDPR for scientific research, analytics. This needs to be broadened, not just to enable health research by health organizations, but by broader group of organizations to enable use of AI, training of AI and algorithms as well. So that would be another area where I think sort of a bit bolder interpretation would be required. But I want to just caveat, when we are bolder in the way we interpret the law as regulators, we have to compensate by asking organizations to be accountable. And that's why, the rules and those 12 accountability steps I talked about, these are compensating measures, right? To enable us to, be more permissive with uses of data. And that's absolutely necessary as well.
Thank you very much, Bojana. I'm sure that some of the areas dealing with going forward in the future, it's something that we could discuss later on with the panel. There are interesting areas in that. Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Benjamin. He's the Chief AI and Data Strategist at Telefonica. Over to you, Richard.
Hello, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm happy to be here and to share some of the lessons we learned using big data in the fight against COVID-19. Next slide, please. So first, it is important to understand what is anonymized and aggregated big data that is privately held. Yeah, here you see Plato's cave. You probably all know the story. There are shadows on the wall, and there are people living in the cave, and the only thing they see is the shadow. They don't see reality. So they create a reality from this shadow. It's a proxy for reality, and that is actually what is happening with aggregated and anonymized big data, mostly held by private organizations. Next slide, please. Here you can see what this means for an operator, in this case Telefonica in Spain. You can see we have about 150,000 antennas, about 1 billion mobile events today, 20 million plus customers, and also many roamers. Yeah, even though this is definitely a day before the confinement. Yeah, this is all anonymized and aggregated, and the activity of the network is a proxy of what is happening, and that proxy has been very important in the crisis. Next slide, please. What you can see that this is recognized across the world. Yeah, so European Commission at the end of March asked European telcos to share data, anonymized and aggregated origin destination matrices, to help understand the propagation of the virus, to help understand how populations are following restrictions in movement, etc. Actually, a few weeks ago, they published the first results, which are publicly available on the European Commission's website. But it's not only Europe, individual countries, Belgium, Germany, across the world have done things to understand how the virus is propagated, how confinement measures are followed up, and many other things, that can help in the fight against COVID. Now let's take a step back. Next slide, please. How have governments in general focused on this? This is a specific, usually used in disaster management. You have the disaster in the response, then you need to act. There's the recovery phase, then there is the mitigation and the prevention phase, and then you have preparedness. Hold on, please, for a moment. So what we've seen across the world is all governments only acted when it happened. Yeah, so nobody acted in advance. Europe, South America, United States, Africa, all the governments acted when the disaster was there. There were only 2 countries in the world that were prepared and they could act directly. Yeah, and this was China and South Korea. Now, this is important to understand because there's a privacy factor here that is different between those countries. And if you look at the recovery phase, next click, please, then you can actually see that this contact tracing, proximity tracing is important to help in the recovery of the economies and to get countries back onto where they were. Yeah. Now, of course, in China and South Korea, there was a lot of data already. Governments have access to even personal data, but in other countries, it was not the case. Yeah? Even the European Commission, they all started 1 month too late, which means that the crisis was already, the virus was already propagated significantly, and drastic measures needed to be taken. Yeah? It's very important to distinguish, was already said before, between personal data used for proximity or contact tracing and aggregated and anonymized data. And what we'll see in one of the lessons is that this difference is not well understood, and that is really creating a lot of problems. Now let's see 3 examples, concrete examples very quickly of what we did with COVID. Next slide, please. So what you see here is on the bottom, you see a timeline with some, on the left side, a bit longer bars than on the right-hand side. So the longer ones are confinement, before the confinement. And then when it goes down, it's actually, it is during the confinement, and it's slowly going up. Now, what we here see is measurement of mobility movements of populations in Spain at the province level. And the only thing that is shared for this data is, for instance, between Madrid and Barcelona at 8 o'clock, or between 8 and 10 in the morning, there are 5,000 movements. Yeah. So the only thing you see is 5,000. And with this, between all the provinces, you draw a map, and this is used by the government to understand how populations are following up. Yeah? And actually today, with actually some new outbreaks, governments can see where there is more mobility than there actually should be. Yeah. Next slide, please. Another example is for France. What you here see is how provinces are connected in terms of people traveling around. Again, anonymized and aggregated data. And on the right and on the right-hand side figure, you see the number of excess deaths compared to 2019. So what you see here, if you look at the color, there is a big overlap. Actually, it's 90% of correlation between how provinces are connected and the number of deaths, which in the end is a proxy of propagation of the virus. Yeah. Next slide, please. We see the last example. Again, an example in Spain. What you see here is in the country, the black lines are provinces, but actually the colors are what we call mobility functional areas. Yeah. Those are areas that connect people in their daily life. This is before confinement. And actually, it means that if you break mobility in those areas, then economic activity goes down. So rather than reactivating so relaxing the confinement to reactivate the economy based on administrative borders, like provinces or regions or cities, if you take those regions into account, you are much likely to incentivize the economy so that countries can back up to speed. Yeah, this is without mobile mobility data in an aggregated analysis form. It's very hard to get here. Next slide, we go to the lessons. Actually, we had 4 lessons. First, and I will go briefly on that in detail afterwards, is the privacy confusion. As we already heard today, people are mixing up mobility data that is aggregated, like statistical information, and personal proximity tracing. Yeah. Press is mixing up, politicians are mixing up, policy is mixing up, and public opinion. Yeah, that's something we need to eradicate. Secondly, there is an ethical question. There are many ethical questions. Should we do this? Should we sacrifice our personal data for this or non-personal data? Versus actually, if we have this capability and we don't use it to manage a crisis, what are the consequences of that? Is it ethical not to use it? Yeah? Then there are some issues on how to make this financially sustainable, because across the world, all of those initiatives with telco operations have been on the pro bonus phase. Yeah? And if this lasts for very many years, then another model probably is needed. Then the last point is that if you use privately held data to take political decisions, some of which are controversial, then actually as a company that's sharing their data is actually might be caught up in controversial political decisions, yeah, which is not something company wants. So those are the lessons learned. Now, very briefly into the privacy discussion. On next slide, please. So there is this misunderstanding. Yeah, on the left-hand side, you see the European data protection supervisor saying it's okay to share telco big data anonymized and aggregated way. It's not under the GDPR, etc. There is anonymization, there is pseudonymization, there is removal of singularity, there is differential privacy that generates noise and distortions, etc. So there's lots of things that actually make it anonymized and aggregated. Then, as Bojano said, the Dutch Data Protection Agency said, no, this is not possible. And there are other organizations that says it's not possible. And it should be a consistent answer, yeah, but there is confusion. And secondly, it's even worse if you look at, this is in Spanish only. Next slide, please. Just to give you an idea, actually there is so a political party actually asked for boycotting this study that the government wants to do with mobility data. And then the arguments they come up, they completely mix up personal proximity tracing and aggregated mobility data. And also, even a large political party is making the same mistakes. They talk also about sacrificing privacy for fighting against COVID. But again, yeah, it's anonymized and aggregated data. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. As a follow-up question, you talked about, was it ethical to use personal data in this? But what about the ethics of using big data for the fight against COVID?
Well, I think here the question is, if the data is aggregated and anonymized, and then becomes basically statistics, yeah? So who is having, let's say, ethical questions about the use of statistics for understanding better how countries work? I think there are little questions about the ethical thing of using the data, and there are indeed some questions about using private data. And I personally think that's because it's not well understood. But I think the question is even worse, yeah, or it's the other side around. If you have this data, and actually if you don't use it to solve big problems like we have now, I think that is not ethical, yeah. So you can't refrain from using an important tool to solve a problem and then not using. I would say it's almost irresponsible, and maybe it's negligent to do that.
To this, yeah, living in Gibraltar, I was very conscious of calls within the southern Spanish province of Andalusia, who wanted residents from Madrid, which when the coronavirus pandemic started, and that was concentrated in Madrid, they were saying they were against getting people or allowing people to move to the southern province. How was this available, this information available from the data you were collecting?
Yes, actually, there was to some kind, it was a surprise because it was all over the news that the provinces near the coast and the sea, they were worried about the health system would be overbooked, overcrowded, because all the people who had a second house from the center, from Madrid, etc. We looked that up at the data, anonymized in an aggregated way, and we didn't see any of those patterns. Yeah, there might be anecdotal things. But it was definitely not the case what was shown on the press, where everybody deduced, well, this is happening at large scale everywhere across the country.
Thanks, Richard. Just remind the audience that if you would like to submit any questions, you have the facility available. Please do so. Let me now move to our next speaker, who is Greg Smolinek from Canada, from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. Sorry, Greg, over to you.
Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. My name is Gregory Smolinek. I've been Deputy Commissioner for Policy and Promotion at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada for almost 2 years now. Inspired by the title of our panel, I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts on the pandemic, the future, and what I see is at stake. For years, the strategic environment of data protection authorities around the world has been evolving and evolving fast. Just look at the speed of technological change and changes in business models, for example. The pandemic has accelerated this already fast pace. Acceleration has affected privacy in myriad ways and serves to underline risks to the human right of privacy and other rights and freedoms for which privacy is an instrumental precondition. In the context of the pandemic, the urgency of limiting the spread of the virus has posed a significant challenge to governments and public health authorities, who have sought ways to use personal information to contain the virus. In response to the pandemic, the OPC has, for your information, adopted a philosophy of flexibility and contextuality. So while privacy laws still apply, we as a regulator have indicated that we are sensitive to the pandemic context and will be flexible. We've also developed guidance in the framework to assist the Canadian government in quickly implementing new initiatives in privacy protective ways. Now, the meaning or meanings of the pandemic are, no doubt, multiple and profound. The human costs themselves are immense, with pain and suffering and death around the world. The pandemic has also affected human behavior and psychology, both on individual and societal levels. Then there are the pandemic's extraordinary effects on economy and commerce, on education and politics and international affairs. Some of these will no doubt be long-lasting. And each of these things will have knock-on effects, indeed profound ones, on privacy. But perhaps the most obvious thing is that the pandemic has accelerated the already fast pace of digitization. Upon reflection, it's evident that we are witnessing developments that amount to an unfolding history in which communications, and more precisely communications technology, is central to epochal social change and to the place of the individual in society. Our challenge is to understand these historical developments, to be able to describe them in sufficient detail so we could see the broader picture that emerges. So what are we dealing with here? The great Canadian communications theorist, Marshall McLuhan, provides some insight. He held that new technologies exert a gravitational effect on cognition, which in turn affects social organization. In McLuhan's analysis, for instance, print technology changed human perceptual habits and social interactions, making possible the most salient trends in the modern period, including individualism, democracy, Protestantism, capitalism, and nationalism. What effects, then, do digital communications technologies have? What has the internet, the smartphone, and more recently, let's say, exposure notification apps, what have they wrought on humankind? We benefit by gaining a broader perspective, by understanding, as McLuhan would have it, the characteristics of the medium. For instance, a smartphone app itself, and how it affects the individual and society. Now, we've entered onto the grounds of thousands of dense dissertations already defended and yet to be written. And I think I could hear groans from across the world on this webinar. And yet, to be clear, I'm not a communications theorist, but I am a historian, and I can clearly discern developments that are affecting the behavior of individuals, as well as our social structures and institutions. And if we don't have complete answers to key questions yet, at least we can venture some of these questions, and perhaps you will have some of the answers. So let's go to McLuhan again and ask, what are the immediate effects of, say, take for example, a prototypical pandemic health app? What does the app enhance? What does the medium make obsolete? What has the medium retrieved that had been rendered obsolete earlier? What can an app flip into when pushed to its extremes? So I confess I haven't really studied in depth apps as media writ large as much as I have the privacy implications of these media. One partial answer that I can discern in response to the question of obsolescence is a decentering of government as the authoritative source of public health advice. Now let's go back to privacy per se. As this audience is fully aware, contemporary privacy law is supposed to carry with it certain obligations for organizations and provide certain rights to individuals. Why is that? Ultimately, because people have a right to understand how information about their person is processed, by whom and for what reasons. Furthermore, beyond a right to an explanation of how their information is used and shared, people have a right to demand accountability. They have a right to lodge complaints and challenge organizations involved. Ultimately, they have a right to choose freely and with meaningful consent, free of coercion. The problem, as I see it, is that the recourse to technological fixes for complex and urgent problems can, in some cases, complicate how individuals exercise their rights. Indeed, mobilizing high-tech systems and digital global networks can magnify existing problems, create new data security risks, for example, or exclude vulnerable populations, and create new inequities. Now, this is not by any means a new diagnosis. Let me problematize this further with 4 high-level observations as a way to reframe our data protection challenges. First, we must acknowledge the enormous pressure that governments around the world have faced to mount a response to the pandemic. Many public authorities have been overwhelmed and in some cases unprepared. We are now witnessing a shift in resources and responsibilities from government organizations to commercial or even personal systems. I would cross-reference this point with the observation regarding the marginalization of government. To put it bluntly, that is what a downloadable pandemic health app is at the end of the day. Government downloading, literally, a core public health function to your phone. Beyond the shift from public responsibility to an individual's private technology, my second point is about the inherent ethereal quality of the scheme. For most users of such apps, the processing is effectively invisible. Like the virus that it is meant to counter, the solution also is invisible. And I would add, is also arguably as poorly understood. This brings me to my third point, namely that data-driven public health programs may flounder on the inscrutability of the technology to most users. Why? Because the underlying API, technical device specs, software coding for such an approach will be largely incomprehensible to most users. So what do we have? At best, instead we have an amorphous, arm's length, at 3 removes sort of government intervention known as nudging. That brings me to my fourth point. That is that digital solutions may affect the well-being, economic opportunities, and liberty of millions of people, and affect them positively. So make no mistake, there could be great benefits. However, that applies if those individuals are lucky enough to have a high-end smartphone. Where does that leave everyone else? I realize all this sounds kind of critical, and I can see that it's far too early to probe what the impact of new digital technologies and smartphones developed in a rush during the pandemic will be. Nothing is written. But McLuhan summed up a key risk in one line, and I quote, "Electronic environments are invisible architectures, and their ground rules, pervasive structures, and overall patterns elude all easy perception." I worry that this characterizes the reimagined city that we have before us. We're driving towards a collective area where we do not see the walls or the guardrails or the danger zones. The pervasive structures may be eluding our perception, but we have to look for them. We have to discern them in the haze. We need to think critically about massively complex public policy problems and technological solutions that may not, in all aspects, adequately address the scale of the challenges. There is no substitute for strategy in which ends, ways, and means are designed in proportion to each other and are adequate to the meaning and the scale of the problem at hand. Sometimes when we reach for apps and phones as the go-to solution, the technology can end up delimiting the scope of the problem, sometimes prematurely. I think defining all public policy challenges as data problems or remediable by narrow technological solutions pushes other issues off the stage. Issues like fulsome strategy formulation, scientific rigor and creativity, leading to new knowledge, public health accountability, proven effectiveness, minimal intrusion, to say nothing of equity, accessibility, and fairness. All technologies have the potential to act as accelerants when a society is already in a state of crisis. And let's be blunt here. Many democracies were already in a crisis before the pandemic struck, with various media affecting individuals, society, and societal values, and the character of our democracies. Trust was already a much depleted resource. Therefore, to conclude, I think that the current responses globally to COVID-19 are plainly highlighting both the potential of technology for the public good, as well as the effects, perhaps yet poorly understood effects, on individuals and society. In our digitized circumstances, then, to effectively protect individual privacy as a human right, which it is, we must also push for technology to be explicable, transparent, distributed, and effective. So I make an appeal here to governments, one for careful planning and to fill the strategy gap, and an appeal for thoughtful information gathering and public health responses that are fair, equitable, transparent, reasonable, and proportional. The first and most basic question is, what ends do we seek for people and for society? Life? Yes. And simultaneously, what kind of life? If somewhere in the answers to this last question we say free and fair and democratic, then privacy is essential. The futures of our medical systems, how we work and learn, how we interact and travel and trade, and how we govern ourselves will all be shaped for years to come by how we deal with the issues and the risks we've just discussed. Thank you again for the invitation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Greg. Certainly food for thought in a lot of your comments. You talked about or made reference to technological fixes. Is this a growing and possibly worrying trend? Do you see it maybe governments using this as an easy cop-out?
So I think that we need to look at the broader implications of technology. So evidently, and without any doubt, obviously technology could serve many useful purposes of public health, benefit individuals, benefit society, without a doubt. I mean, it's sort of self-evident. It's those ancillary, broader implications of technology that I think we don't necessarily contemplate when new technologies are developed and launched that we need to put our mind to. So I think there might be a recourse to technological fixes. They're not inherently bad, but they could be, depending on their design and, of course, their utility, distractions from broader and equally important measures.
Okay, thanks, Greg. I believe Richard wants to ask you a question. Richard, if you will come on, put your camera on, you can go ahead and ask Greg your question.
It's really interesting presentation and thoughts that you gave. Yeah? Almost philosophical and very profound. Yeah. But I'm from the Netherlands, so I'm very practical and pragmatic. So you launched a lot of questions about fairness, explainability of systems, etc. So of course it will take some time, as you say. But what do we do in the meantime? So do we do nothing because we are not sure how the answers are, or do we take a risk like we're doing now? And let's see, if we don't do anything, maybe it's even worse. So we live in an uncertain world. So the message I got from you is don't do anything, but I would want to confirm that.
No, that's certainly not my message. And there are a lot of opportunities to implement new technologies, pandemic health apps, and so on that may well be very, very purposeful and very helpful. So no, definitely my message is not don't do anything. And as I indicated, our office has consciously adopted an attitude of flexibility in helping to facilitate new initiatives and to work very quickly to make sure that new initiatives are privacy protective as they're rolled out. So by no means is my message do nothing or don't do anything. So I would point out, for instance, like around the world, there is a movement to develop exposure notification apps, and this is good. If exposure notification apps can help limit the spread of the contagion, obviously this is very good. The question is for people without those phones. Let's say that those apps that are based on the Apple Google API. Necessitate the use of iPhones or Android. My question is, what thought has been given to those populations that are excluded from this exposure notification system because they don't possess iPhones or Android phones? How much thought has been given by governments to this sizable population? This is, I think, not a terribly obscure question. But I would say that it's probably not addressed sufficiently. That's just an example.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, so if you look at the apps, well, there are people who have no access to those apps. If you look at how many people use it in the countries where they are launched, it's only 10 or 20%. Yeah? So there are a lot of people who exclude themselves from these opportunities, and not let alone speaking of explainability. Yeah? So those are completely black boxes. If you get a message from such an app, you are maybe infected, please contact the hospital. Well, based on what? Yeah? So you have no clue. You just have to, but still, yeah. All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'd like to ask our other two panelists to turn their cameras on, so they can also take part in this discussion. I know that Bojana wants to ask Greg something, but I've also already have quite a few questions of the audience. So after Bojana, I think we'll go to audience questions.
Okay, thank you, Paul. In fact, it was more of a comment, and in fact, I'm interested in everybody's view on this. I think what this pandemic has taught us is that in the absence of a strategic, Gregory, to your point, strategic leadership from our governments and politicians, and maybe even regulators, private sector had to step up and take initiative, right? People were asking and demanding, solve this problem, right? And so this kind of brings 2 points. One is governments have to be now used, and regulators, to this new way of dealing with private sector that is becoming ever so more important and potent when it comes to data. And secondly, the role of some of these organizations has just gone through the roof because they're becoming like critical infrastructure. And we may not like that, or we may like that, but I think that is the fact of life. So I think, how do we deal with this new world where governments are big spenders, but not the ultimate creative solution makers, and companies, big organizations, big tech communications companies are really gaining in popularity and importance because of the role they play and the ability to use data and to help us all. So I think that to me is like things have swapped and changed in this new world, like Alice through the looking glass. You know what I mean? So I'm interested in some comments from everybody else. Do you agree?
Greg, you were going to comment?
So I was going to say that I think Bojana raises a very important point. And I think this reflects how some structures are changing due to new technologies. So you have a different role for private enterprises in, let's say, the management of public health than you may have had previously. So these are phenomenally important developments. And I'm not aiming to pass any moral judgment on that development, but there is a fundamental question about how we govern ourselves and what the laws. So in Canada, for instance, we have a Public Sector Privacy Act and we have a Private Sector Privacy Act. And they're not quite harmonized. Yet we now see the digitization of government services that are using, in the case I just invoked, APIs from private sector companies. And so you have this phenomenon of public-private partnerships in all kinds of digital services that is a growing phenomenon around the world. In the Canadian case, our laws are out of date to manage this new phenomenon. My answer to this is to make sure that across all sectors, there's a recognition that privacy is a human right, and on that basis to harmonize the laws. That's my sort of short and trying to be pithy solution to how to address these challenges as technology changes, as structure changes, that we have a common understanding of fundamental values that are internationally recognized, such as privacy as a human right.
Simon, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I was going to pick up on a theme which I think both, I think all speakers actually have touched on in different ways along here, which is, this crisis has made some already kind of obvious facts very, very stark, and I think our reliance globally on a small number of large digital platforms is one of them, and I'd say it's that I know, Greg, you mainly focus on, say, the private sector versus public sector. I think there's within the private sector, it very often is, you know, a small number of private sector firms. And to be clear, I don't necessarily mean that as a wholly toxic thing. I think we are massively, you know, people really benefited from the role technology has played in this crisis overall, and they've also benefited from the ability of Amazon to manage logistics and et cetera, et cetera. It's not as if these digital platforms have been malevolent. And I personally would say that the work Google and Apple have done together on their contact tracing API has been incredibly helpful and overall largely privacy preserving. So I don't want to come over as being anti-digital platform, but I do think that it's that there were certain markets and certain scenarios where these large digital platforms prior to COVID were saying, well, this is a competitive landscape and there's lots of players and this and that. And it's now become clear quite how, A, how dominant they are, and B, how reliant we are as a society on them. And if I'm a politician or a civil servant in a government somewhere, I'd be slightly unnerved by that, because I like to think that I'm the person who's running the country. And now I feel, well, there's these organisations out there which are too big to fail. I was mainly working in financial services in the last financial crisis, and we realised that none of the banks were too big to fail. So I do think that one of the medium-term consequences of this discussion we're having, which goes beyond privacy, to be clear, I'm now talking about competition and privacy together, and the role data plays in our lives, is that you know, governments and society around the world will look at our reliance both on technology but also on a small number of firms and say, well, how does that work? Are we comfortable with that dynamic? And I'll say it one more time, that's I'm not saying that the tech firms are necessarily a malevolent presence in here. I'm just saying that our reliance globally on those organizations has been made apparent.
Richard.
Yes, so I would like to take the other angle. Yeah, so I'm working since many years in an area community called Big Data for Social Good, where you try to use privately held data from telcos, from banks, from utility companies, etc., to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah, obviously pandemics is one of them, but poverty, other health things, whatever. I've done many of those projects. I have not been able to convince, I think, one government or humanitarian organization to invest in those projects. They all think they have to be philanthropic. Yeah? We actually actively try to pitch a solution for pandemics in the past, because we already know that we can do it since 2014 with the Zika, with Ebola, with swine flu, but we haven't convinced a government to do it. So I think that's for the governments to reflect on why haven't we reacted as we should. Yeah? And I think, of course, this is the past. So I think what we should look at, if you all remember the big tsunami in 2004, in the Indian Ocean, 300,000 people died. 10 years later, there was a system in place, a tsunami alert system, that alerts all the coasts in case of a tsunami. I think we should do something similar with this. Yeah, we should be prepared. Governments should not be waiting for companies to do things by them. They should invest. Yeah, they should procure systems, and they should not think that is not done because this data is all sitting with large companies and they have to give it for free. Actually, Google and Apple, they published it for free. We have given it for free to the government. Actually, was it the government in the beginning of the pandemic? There was not even interest to look at those things. So I think there is a digital mindset. Companies have gone through a digital transformation. Governments are still having to do that. And I think that's a responsibility that governments need to recognize. And I haven't seen any government who has recognized that so far.
Okay. We've got about 15-20 minutes left. I'd like to move to some of the questions. We've had quite a few come in. The first question, which I'll read out, says, today people have already released so much of information through Facebook. Why is this such a big issue, releasing data now for part of the pandemic? People have false information by seeing too many movies.
Well, I mean, if something is doing wrong, it doesn't mean we can all do wrong, yeah?
Yeah.
So it doesn't make it good what is happening with Facebook.
Greg, you wanted to comment on that?
Go on, Greg, after you.
I would of course, some people have no personal inhibitions about sharing their information on Facebook widely. That may be their personal choice. They may consent to it, and so be it. The issue is when their personal information is used without, for instance, their consent, sometimes perhaps for some malign purposes, perhaps even deliberately to harm them, or to exploit their personal information for other purposes which they don't agree to. So, I mean, this does happen, and it happens far too often. But if you dig down, that there are perhaps deeper implications, for instance, for democratic processes, and then people probably can't be indifferent to those consequences.
There's a question which I think is a good follow-up to what we were talking about. No, I'm not on mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can.
Okay. I've got a follow-up question, really, which it ties in with what you were talking about, the Google and Apple API and how they have worked towards this. And someone who said, are we ready to forget about profits for the good of people's health and start work one with each other?
But
Bojana.
let me sort of, I think actually Google Apple initiative is extraordinary in that way. I mean, these were both of my friends. I have friends working there, right? But the fact is that these are competitors very often, and it was amazing they put their heads together, their engineers together, and actually sharing some of the underlying sort of structural and technical and systems data in order to be able to provide something like this. Listen. Companies today are not only driven by profits. I think they are largely driven by profits, but there are other things at play. And this is something that I very much believe is going to be changing in the post-COVID world. You know, it will be a bit like asking, what have you done through, you know, what was your role in the war, in the last war? You know, if you ask your grandfather or somebody like that, well, it's a little bit like this. What did you do during the COVID? And I think companies need to be showing to actually be doing the right thing. Their employees are requesting that. We are now seeing, and I don't know, Richard, tell me about Telefonica, but we are seeing employees in tech companies from Microsoft to Amazon to Google, Facebook demanding certain behaviors, right? You know, we have got companies who have stopped producing facial recognition software for the use by governments, and particularly undemocratic ones, right? Because they're saying that's not what we want to do. We will have a process which will exclude those because employees have put that pressure. So, you know, people want to work for ethical and good companies. So I think this whole emphasis on doing the right thing is going to grow. Please do not forget, there is a big movement out there from investment community on what we call this ESG, right? Environmental, social, and governance. And I think privacy and data is going to be tagged onto that. I'm no doubt the shareholders are going to be asking, you know, will we get the shareholder value? Not only because we're going to maximize our profit, but because actually we're going to be trusted and responsible business that investors will invest in, that people will want to work with, and that other business partners will want to interact. So I predict more corporate digital responsibility as a result of COVID, because I think that's where boards and smart companies are going to be pushed more.
Greg,
and I hope I'm not going to be wrong, but you know, I take a bet.
Yeah.
Greg, you I think wanted to, and then we'll move to Richard.
Sure. I just want to add what I consider to be a contextual comment. I think what complicates the picture in some instances, let's say we're talking about private sector pandemic health responses, is that so many companies now are considering themselves to be data companies, and many are moving into the health field. So many companies also have new lines of business related to health information. So that kind of complicates the picture a little bit when it comes to the interaction and the interface with government services, that maybe aren't procured through traditional competitive procurement methods. So it's not a critical comment. It's just that there's a context here that's unfolding where you have major big tech companies moving into the healthcare sector, and that gives them different interests than and that don't necessarily overlap the way they do with democratic governments. So just the context piece.
Richard.
Yeah, I think I agree with Bojana. It is a trend. Yeah, companies are becoming more responsible, but I think it's by far and large still profits that make the world go round. Yeah, look alone at all the companies that go out of business because of the crisis. Yeah, if there were other things relevant, they could maybe live on those other things that are relevant, like responsibility, but it's not. Yeah. Either you have an economic profitable model or you're dead. So I think as long as that is not changing, the world will keep going like it is. Yeah.
Well, if I can add, I think lots of great points. All the points I wanted to make have largely been made, but just an observation building on Bojana's kind of, what do you do in the war type discussion. After the Second World War, in many countries there was a feeling that all this had to mean something. So in the UK, for particular, a left-wing government got elected. That they went on to build the NHS and other fine institutions. And I do wonder whether that's going to be a bit of a spirit of the next few years. As we come out of this pandemic and we've realised our reliance on key workers and our vulnerability to global events and our interdependency on supply chains that go around the world. There's a range of, there's going to be different consequences to how people view themselves and view society and view how their data is used as part of that we need to give some thought to. And I won't pretend to have a crystal ball to know how that unfolds, but I think it would be unwise to think that people's attitudes to how both how their data is used and actually their sense of self is going to continue to evolve over the next few years.
Another question we've had come in is, are there lessons, really the coordination or lack of it, between DPAs and the likes of Google and Apple during the crisis? Are there lessons to be learned?
I mean, I don't mind starting on this.
Yep.
Google and Apple dropped us a courtesy call before they announced their planning their API, and we then invested time to produce what was only the second commissioner's opinion when the details of the API first came out, and with lightning speed for a regulator, by the end of that week on the Friday we issued the opinion. And that was because we thought there was it was a positive contribution to the discussion. We thought there were some strong privacy preserving elements to it, and we wanted to put a stake in the ground as to what we thought was good practice in this area. After that, as many people here know, for the next few weeks, the UK pursued a different option, and it's now gone back to pursuing the Google Apple option. And as such, our opinion is suddenly went from being a bit irrelevant in the UK, although actually quite well appreciated by our international colleagues, through to being relevant again. But we wanted to move fast on that because, as we've already noted, that we thought there was some positive aspects to that. So, and I know that there's been other initiatives, and including at the Global Privacy Assembly, which is the group of data protection authorities around the world. It's their association, where there's been discussions, and Google Apple have continued to brief authorities on that. So I think overall that's been a positive experience. But at the same time, there's been plenty of divergence between different data protection authorities around aspects of contact tracing. We can't beat around the bush there. And for global organisations, I'm sure it's been very frustrating. And it's one of those things where, to be honest, it would have been great if there had been some kind of consistent global approach to this. But given the speed of the pandemic and the nature of the regulatory frameworks we work in, that would always be wishing for a bit too much. But would it have been better if there's more global coordination on contact tracing and that whole area? Well, yes, obviously.
We have And another question, which is, I think it says, can the laws keep up with the fast-changing technological environment? And it's something I think certainly as data protection authorities, we have certainly discussed this on several occasions.
Can I maybe kick off that?
Yes,
so
please.
I think the short answer is no, so no, they can't. But what we can do is write smart laws. And what smart laws do is, first of all, include principle-based foundations. So, we kind of have some principles. They also put onus on the operators, on those who are using data, both governmental organizations and companies, through accountability, to translate those principles in operational controls, to show, demonstrate their accountability, responsibility, oversight, audits, all of the things, and be able to demonstrate that. And they've got regulators who are smart and are able to use nudge theory and behavioral economics, frankly, to actually move the market. And then they reserve enforcement for those who are deliberately, negligently, always, breaking those laws. So I think laws which are principle-based with an effective risk-based strategic regulator who actually navigates, right, and incorporates the best practices and incentivizes.
Bojana seems to have been frozen out.
Well, whilst Bojana unfreezes, Paul, I'll pick that one up, because I completely agree with what Bojana was saying about, there's elements of accountability and principles-based regulation which help with regulators keeping up. And at the same time, regulators will never be perfect in this, because the resources and that would be required for regulators to be ahead of the market don't exist. Those resources are in the market, and that's where they should be. But I do think the other side of the coin is something that is close to my heart, which is having innovation functions within regulators. That's part of my world, and we do a lot of work both to help innovators, say through our regulatory sandbox and our work through our regulators hub on innovation. But through doing so, we don't just help individual innovators or indeed the economy. We also learn, and that is actually where we get most value. Is if by engaging with innovators and helping innovation happen, we learn what is the cutting edge of the market. So, for instance, through our sandbox, we learned a whole range of points around, say, facial recognition. That informed our facial recognition guidance we put out, and around health data sharing that informs some aspects of our COVID response. So we learn through innovation, and we learn through supporting innovation. And that's my other plea is accountability and principles. Absolutely agree with Bojana on that. But engaging with innovators and being part of that ecosystem is also a critical part to not keeping up with every innovation that comes out, but keeping within a respectable distance.
Yep. Greg, yes.
Quick follow-up. So if you want to give privacy laws some shelf life, I think they should be tech neutral. Privacy principles are great to have in them. But then I would add that if they have a rights basis that centers the dignity of individuals, of people, that will give your privacy laws longevity.
Bojana, we lost you for a while. Was there anything that you wanted to add?
No, it's fine. I've said it, mate. Thank you.
Okay. We've got 3 minutes left. I think that what we will do is go round each of you. If you any final comments from you, and then we'll wrap up. Simon, if I can start with you.
I would come back to the thing that there are, we are in the middle of a very horrible situation with the COVID pandemic, and it's as everyone's noted here, and I think Greg was very eloquent on this. There's some big fundamental threats through reacting in a crisis, but there has been innovation through this crisis as well, and there's necessity some other innovation, and we have learned things about ourselves and about how technology works and data works. And as we emerge from the crisis, I think we all have to work very hard in regulators, in the private sector, within society, to make sure we realise some of those gains as we get back to a functioning society and economy.
Bojana.
So I would perhaps say two things. One is thing that we haven't talked about, which is we have to make sure that the governments of the world do not use this crisis to increase more their surveillance and long reach into data and companies. And I think there is a bit of that happening, and we must absolutely kind of say no, right? But on the positive side, I'm sort of super optimist that we have learned amazing lesson on kind of data and digital. And I really think that this data and digital has actually put privacy in the forefront of all of our minds. But it is privacy which is not the only right, but privacy that is actually balanced with other rights and other needs of our society. So I would hope that regulators would learn that lesson to be this dual role, that companies will also understand the responsibility and privacy. And of course, as I say, governments must do this as well.
Thank you. Richard.
So I would like to make a call for honestly learn from this experience. Yeah? To learn and to explicitly state what went well and what didn't go well. Yeah? And don't be afraid to acknowledge that you made a mistake, either as a company or as a government. Yeah. What I see is that everybody wants to look great on the photo. They want to say we did this, everything is going fine, but they know there are big problems. Yeah, and that prevents us from actually really learning about what we need to do to be able to prepare this and other big problems in the future.
Thank you, Greg.
So the challenges are big. We've been forced to and have to respond quickly, but at the same time, we have to think deeply about these things, and we have to understand where we're going and what are the longer term implications of some of the solutions that we put in place.
Thank you very much. Thank you to my four panelists, Simon McDougall, Bojana Bellamy, Dr. Richard Benjamins, and Gregory Smolinek. We've had a good response of questions. I apologize, we have not been able to get through 2/3 of those we've received. Thank you to our audience and for the interest you have shown. We've had some good comments come through as well. And just a final note to say that this webinar will be available on the IIC's website in a few days. Thank you very much to all of you.